Good morning. I want to welcome you all. Thank you for your presence. We are thankful for those who are joining us by way of Facebook. I believe that we have gotten it working. And so thankful for that. I came up here and played with it the other day. It's a learning process for someone like myself who is technologically left behind. But thankful for it nonetheless. We have been able to record and get most of the things posted. But nonetheless, we are in Matthew 15 this morning. We're in Matthew 15 this morning. If you want to join me there, what a beautiful day indeed. In Matthew chapter 15, beginning in verse 1, Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. Now, from the very beginning, Jesus had followers from Jerusalem. If you recall in Matthew chapter number 4, at around verse number 25, we have this recorded for us. And there followed him, that is Jesus, great multitudes of people from Galilee and from Decapolis and from Jerusalem and from Judea and from beyond Jordan. And so Jesus had followers from Jerusalem, and by this time, Jesus has already been to Jerusalem 2 times. He had already been there twice. We find that John chapter 2, John chapter 5, and now we have this incident where the leaders from Jerusalem send delegates, if you will. They send people to Jesus because they are interested in what he is saying. If you recall in John chapter 1, in John chapter 1, John writes this, and this is the record of John. When the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, Who art thou? See, remember the leaders from Jerusalem had been taking note of John and all of the disciples that he is making and the things that he's teaching, and they say, we've got to check him out. Because Jerusalem was the religious capital of the world. The who's who in religion are at Jerusalem. And these scribes and these Pharisees, the Pharisees are the largest sect of the Jewish people. And they are the religious conservatives, ultra-conservative, if you will. They go beyond, and I'm saying ultra as in they go beyond what they should, and it was not good. It was not good at all, and Jesus is going to deal with this at this time. These Jewish people, especially those of Jerusalem, and the Pharisees had already been offended by Jesus. You remember they were offended when Jesus ate with the tax collectors and sinners. They didn't appreciate that, did they? They were offended when Jesus pronounced the sins of an individual forgiven. When the people let down the young man from the roof, and he said, Thy sins be forgiven thee. And the Pharisees were standing on the outside of the wall, and what did they think within their heart? This man's blaspheming, and Jesus called them on it. They did not appreciate that. They called Jesus onto the carpet for violating Sabbath traditions. Why do your disciples violate the Sabbath as they grab the ears of corn? And so they had already been offended by the things that Jesus was doing and teaching. And so they see him as a threat. They see his teachings as a threat. And so they have already a couple times tried to dress him down, if you will, without any success. And they're hoping that this time they're going to have more success and in their ability to dress him down. He says here, why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. Now the actions of the disciples are put on the teacher. The teacher, you are guilty because of what your disciples are doing. And there's no doubt Jesus had probably instructed them in the things that they needed to do. And Jesus had probably instructed them not to worry about that ceremonial washing, if you will. Do you think that as they were out in the wilderness, what has just taken place? One of the greatest things, it's recorded in all four accounts. What had just taken place? What did Jesus do? He fed the masses. And they were in a wilderness area. Do you think that they had a jug of the water of purification to do this ceremonial washing before Jesus had the whole multitude sit down to eat? No. No, he just had them sit down and he blessed it, break it, and gave it to them. So they ask, according to your disciples, they are transgressing the tradition of the elders. Now this isn't the people that are in charge in Jerusalem now. In Jewish history, the older the rabbi, the older the elder went back into antiquity, the more venerable, the more respected their word was. And so he says, these rabbis from long ago who have taught us and handed down these traditions. That's what the word tradition is handed down, handed over. And they have handed down or handed over these teachings concerning the law. And there came a time where these oral traditions were written down in what the Jews call the Mishnah, which is their commentary on the law. It's all the added laws, what the law means per their interpretation of it. And he says, your guys, your disciples, transgress the tradition of the elders. They come right out and admit that it's not the law, that it's not the law of God. They come right out and admit that it's the tradition of the elders. And what does that tell us? How do they view their traditions? More important than God's law. More important than what God had related to Moses on the mountain. Now their tradition was that when God was on the mountain and Moses had met him on Mount Sinai and received the law, that God had also related this oral part of the law to Moses. And that Moses came off the mountain with the stone tablets and an oral law that he taught to the elders, and they just passed that down and passed that down and passed that down, which is not true, because a lot of these laws came about to try to keep them from going back into something like Babylonian captivity. It was their fence around the law because they had broken the law and they had gone into captivity. And so to keep them from doing that again, they kept adding and kept adding and kept, which is a denial of the fact that God had given this tradition to Moses on Mount Sinai. You can't have it both ways. If God had given it to Moses on Mount Sinai, do you think they would have had it before Nebuchadnezzar took them off to Babylon? Yeah, you see, it doesn't work that way. But they have transgressed the tradition of the elders, for they wash not their hands when they eat bread. This is not a hygienic thing. This is not about hygiene. This was a ceremonial cleansing. The priests, before they offer sacrifices, wash themselves ceremonially. And they offer these sacrifices, and it makes them ceremonially clean. Well, the Jews come along and they think, well, you could have touched anything that was, and you are defiled, you're unclean, and then you eat that your food, and you've touched it with the ceremonially unclean hands, and then you eat that food that you have defiled with your ceremonially unclean hands, and that then defiles the person. And Jesus is going to say, nonsense. They bring up this question, which is not really a question at all. It's a charge. It's an accusation. And Jesus' response is so important. He answered and said unto them, why do you transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? Which was in the form of what a rabbi would do, a teacher. They many times use the form of questions to make their points. And Jesus is going to take the fingers that are pointed at him and point them right back. But it's going to be different. Jesus is not arguing from the base of a tradition. But Jesus is saying, you have violated the commandment of God by your tradition. Notice this. Here's the example. For God commanded, saying, honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, now this is in contrast to what the law of God says. The commandment of God said this, but you say, by your tradition, whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, it is a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. Thus have you made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition, ye hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draw nigh to me with their mouth, they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. This is important for us because many times this section is so misunderstood. What is he saying? God commanded, verse 4, honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. Is this strict adherence and obedience to the parents? Well, a child should do that. But what about when the child grows up and is out on their own and in their own home? See, this term, honor, has a financial obligation within it. And what he is saying here is when your parents get to the age where they can no longer take care of themselves, then child, it's your responsibility to take care of them, to honor them. Last week, I think I misquoted one of the texts, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17. Paul says there, those that serve well the elders, they are worthy of double honor. I think I called it verse 8, but it's verse 17. Verse 3 of 1 Timothy 5 says, widows that are widows indeed. You honor widows that are widows indeed. He's talking about financial support. Financially helping. Now, when your parents get to the age where they can no longer financially support them, the child is to honor them. The child is to step up and do that which the parent did for them their whole life, up until the point that they could no longer work and make a living. Now, there was a command, there was an injunction upon the breaking of the command in Exodus 21. Honor your father and mother. But the punishment was, and that was, children, you grow up, you honor, you obey, but that obligation from a child changed in adulthood to also providing for. And if you don't honor your parents, there was a punishment. Let him die the death. Well, the Pharisees come along, and they don't want to use their resources to take care of their parents. And so what do they look for? What do many people look for in the law today? Loopholes, an out. And especially when finances are involved, right? If I am legally and divinely obligated to care for my aged parents, then that means my resources are not all mine. But so how can I get out of this? Notice what he says. But you say, whosoever shall say to his father and his mother, it is a gift, whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, Mom, whatever thou mightest be profited by me, Dad, it's a gift. Mark uses the word Corban, which is, in Mark chapter 7, which is, this idea is that all of my resources are dedicated to God. And so all of my resources are then dedicated to the temple and to God's work. So then, I can't take what is dedicated to God and give it to you, Mom. I can't take what's dedicated to God and give it to you, Dad. But the messed up thing about this vow was, all of their resources were still within their control. All they did was vow it to the temple. All they did was vow it to God. They didn't actually go transfer all of their wealth and all of their substance to the temple. And so it was done in selfishness. It was done in greed. And it was done in such a way that they could circumvent the law of God. And so, and I'll get to you in just a second.
I was just going to say it's selfish.
It's selfishness and greed. And it is deep down inside the most heinous thing that a person could do, right? They feign religion and they feign righteous motives to really hide their wickedness. Does this go on today? Absolutely. They use a cloak of religion to go around and to get around and to do whatever they want to do, circumventing the law of God, and really inside they are unwashed cups. Really inside, like Jesus would say, you are a whitewashed sepulcher. Inside, you're full of dead men's bones. You're full of corruption. That's what these people are doing with their tradition and the commandment of God. They have made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Is it good to vow and dedicate your substance to God? Yeah, absolutely. Nothing wrong with that. Is it good to honor your father and mother and to provide for them in a time which they cannot care for themselves. Absolutely. Now, between the two, which one is superior? Which one does God want you to do the most in that time?
By taking care of our parents, we are obeying God.
Absolutely. The primary, the most important thing a person could do in honoring God would be to take care of their parents in a time when they need it.
Told the rich man to sell all and give it to the poor.
Yeah. God owns it all. God has never been short on resources. God needs his people down here to be his hands and feet down here in service to people. God has the resources. God can tell Peter, go down there and cast a hook. And the fish that you catch is going to have your tax money in its mouth. God's never been short on resources. God needs people to love people, families to love families, and for families to take care of themselves, especially when children are young. God needs the parents to train them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And when the parents are aged, God needs the children to look after their parents, to honor them. And yes, that is also financial. But these wicked people, they wanted to keep their dollars and keep their cents using the loophole of, well, it's dedicated to God, but they never planned on giving God the money. They just planned on not having to be responsible to take care of their parents. And that's wickedness. And that's why Jesus says, you hypocrites, in verse 7, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, Isaiah prophesied to the ancients 750 years before Christ concerning the Babylonian captivity. But what Jesus does is Jesus sees in this generation of people that he's talking to, he sees something in them that God saw in the ancient Jews prior to the Babylonian captivity. And Isaiah brings out that the Jews considered Jerusalem this wonderful, beautiful place, and it was. But they were so entrenched and so enamored with their own heritage that they trusted in their heritage and in their history more than they did their own holiness at the time. They were an unholy people. They were a wicked people. But these unholy, wicked people said, you know what? We're the greatest people that God's ever made on the face of this earth. We're Abraham's seed. We've got the temple. We've got it made. And Jesus said they were hypocrites, and so are you. He said, this people, they draw nigh unto me with their mouth. Oh, they make a vow. They vow their substance to God. They honor me with their lips. They say all the right things. But where's their heart? Their heart is far from me. And what did that profit them? Nothing. In Psalm chapter 51 and verse 6, God desires truth where? In the inward parts. These people had a cloak of religion. These people had a facade of what they claimed to be, but inwardly they were something completely different. And God knows the difference. God sees through the shell. God sees straight into the heart, and that's where he desires truth. That's where he desires the true loyalty and service from the heart. And then he says, but in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Now in this, Jesus has just violently attacked the Pharisees' position. For one, he says that there is something called vain worship. And does anybody believe in that today? I mean, outside of our brethren, outside of the church, worship is worship, and whatever you have a talent of or with, God is then just responsible to accept whatever you can do. Whether it's dance up here like a ballerina, they call that worship. They come up here and they twirl flags, and they do all of these things, and they call it worship. And God's just got to accept it, right?
Every bit of it's vain.
It's all vain. Now, concerning worship, in Genesis chapter number 4, we have the first recorded controversy between God and his people. And this is what it is about: worship. Notice this. And Adam knew Eve, his wife. She conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. This is important. Verse number 6. And the Lord said unto Cain, why are you wroth? Why are you upset? You have no right to be upset, Cain. He says, why are you wroth, and why has your countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Now in Hebrews chapter 11, we find out why Abel's sacrifice was acceptable to God. And why is that? It was offered by faith. How does faith come? By hearing the word of God. Romans chapter 10, verse 17. God has never kept men in the dark relative to what he expects. Now in Genesis chapter 4, we don't have the scene revealed to us where God told Cain and Abel exactly what he expected. But it's obvious that he did, because one of them did the right thing, and God accepted his sacrifice.
Yeah, and that Genesis 4 and 6, he actually challenges Cain to do better.
He does. He does. There's a lot of conversation about what is going on there, but the text is almost like God provides and lays an acceptable sacrifice at the door of Cain. And he says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And sin, sacrifice, is laying at the door, and its will is under your control. You can rule over it. Offer that sacrifice and be accepted. What was the problem? Cain loved his garden more than he loved his God. And Cain thought, you know what? I've worked so hard rearing these tomatoes. I've worked so hard growing these zucchinis. And I have brought forth the most beautiful produce from the ground, and God has blessed me with his talent, so God must accept this offering and this worship from me. It don't work like that. And it don't work like that today either. God has always expounded to men his expectation. And men are then responsible to do it. God says, sing, fruit of the lips, melody in the heart. To give as we've been prospered, thankfully, not grudgingly. To pray always, to come together and to provoke one another to love and good works. And anything that undermines that is not acceptable. It's just not. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. These Pharisees had taken their oral traditions and they hadn't just set them equal to God's law. They had set them over God's law. One of the ancient rabbis, and this went back for centuries, they said to eat with unwashen hands was just as sinful as a man sleeping with a prostitute. If you did not wash your hands before you eat in that ceremonial fashion, then you are just as guilty as if you had committed adultery on your wife and went and slept with a prostitute. And that's how they viewed it. And how do you see that? When you hear that, what is your first thought? For me, that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous.
They're saying that, like, cheating on your wife, you're cheating on us. You're not doing you're not being faithful to us.
Right.
That's how they saw it.
Jesus, he deals with this, and he lays bare their problems, and it was so much more than what they would like to suggest. And he says here, in Matthew 23, going, let's begin in verse 13. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against them. That's exactly the problem with with what we're talking about today. Because he says, you transgress the commandment of the tradition of our elders, and those that they viewed who were not transgressing God's law, but was not walking toe in step with the tradition, they were shut out. And just to let you know, the Sadducees, they did not accept the oral tradition. Now, they had their own faults. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe in spirits. But they did not accept the Pharisees putting on people all of these extra burdens. So he says here in Matthew 23, you shut up the kingdom of heaven. You neither go in yourselves. Does God allow people to bind laws? Are men lawmakers for God? Absolutely not. Neither suffer you them that are entering to go in. Woe to you, for you devour widows' houses, and for pretense, they're fake, they make long prayer. They, verse 15, you compass land and sea to make one proselyte, and when he's made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, or whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. You fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing, but whoso sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is guilty. You fools. He's laying bare how he feels about these people. Let's see, he says, verse 23, you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done. You ought to have paid your tithes and not left the other undone. You've got to show judgment, mercy, and faith. He says you swallow, you strain a gnat, swallow a camel. That's how ridiculous they are. They make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. That's what we've been talking about today. He says that they need to clean within the cup and platter and then make the outside clean also. There is nothing wrong with being religiously pious and that being an obvious trait. But the most important thing is inner purity. And he says, you are like white sepulchres, indeed appear beautiful outward, but within are full of dead men's bone and all uncleanness. Even so you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but within you're full of hypocrisy and iniquity. And then down here, he tells them that they would bind heavy things upon people that they themselves would not even try to lift a finger to. That's what these Pharisees were doing. Lip service, if you will. And it made them look big and feel big, but inside and in reality, they were not big at all. They were hypocrites, and the Lord said so. We're out of time. We will pick up in verse 10 next week. Thank you for your participation and your attention.